Political economist Dr Dale McKinley is an independent writer and researcher. He joins us now to look forward to the visit. A very good evening to you, Dale. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So this state visit will be the first of King Charles III's reign. What can we expect?
Well, first of all, there's the pomp and ceremony. After he arrives, you're going to have a guard of honor a ceremonial sort of welcome down in central London, inspect a guard of honor. Then there'll be this carriage thing that goes to the Buckingham Palace and be escorted by mounted guards. And then basically that evening, there'll be a state banquet. But this is where the real sort of business, I guess, comes along, because I think not too many people know that these state visits are actually coordinated not necessarily by the monarchy itself and by Buckingham Palace, but by the Foreign Office in particular and the Commonwealth Office. So up to 150 people will be invited to that dinner, and most of them will be business people and people with cultural, political, and economic ties to South Africa that are in the UK. So it is quite an opportunity for a whole range of things to be discussed and talked about, at least, or contacts to be made. And then after that, in the following days, usually what happens is, in this case, President Ramaphosa will meet with various economic and political, business and other leaders. And then that will be the end of the trip. So that's formally what will happen.
So the President of South Africa, having accepted this invitation from His Majesty the King, is he the only African leader to be invited back so soon after the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, and why?
Yes, he is. There's no one else invited. In fact, the last state visit to the UK was by Donald Trump in 2019. And then, of course, COVID hit and everything came to a halt. So why? Well, the speculation is first of all, that it was planned beforehand, as our Naledi Pandor just mentioned, that the Queen had already planned this. So it would have been unusual for them to just cancel it. So I think King Charles inherited this visit. But more than that, it seems as though the primary purpose, really, besides just the recognition of the state visit, is the Commonwealth issue. And South Africa, despite our problems, despite the fact that we punch way above our weight generally, and we've been losing a lot of that in the last few years, we still remain the closest sort of both culturally, politically, and economically tied to the UK of any African country, generally speaking. We still retain a strategic and security importance in sub-Saharan Africa to the UK and to the European Union. We also, given the events in Ukraine, and given the events in Europe with energy crises and the new search for gas, for example, deposits and other kinds of things, once again, Southern Africa becomes a strategic and business interest. And so I think all of those kinds of things will certainly be on the agenda, more outside of the sort of pomp and circumstance, will be on the agenda that could be beneficial if used properly in terms of this visit for us in relation to shoring up some of those relationships and recapturing, in some cases, the space that we've lost on the international stage.
So, as you mentioned, that the UK's head of state, monarch, makes and hosts state visits with foreign royals, presidents or prime ministers, which are arranged on the advice of governments of Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So the process of elimination, you mentioned South Africa's strategic importance in various areas, but it would amount to some sort of a quid pro quo. So at this stage, what would Britain be looking to us for, particularly with regards to the Commonwealth, the conversations that have been undertaken over the past couple of weeks, particularly in terms of relevance and the new monarch himself, the direction he would take things, if at all? And what would we be looking from the UK with this new leadership, Liz Truss, and now the new PM as well?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the King himself, I mean, we've also heard rumors, for example, that Liz Truss doesn't want the King to go to New Zealand to talk about climate change issues. And this has been one of the King's key things. And we've just a while back, it was announced that there was going to be quite a lot of funding coming from the EU, and the UK being one of the central components of that, for a more just transition, a transition away from coal in South Africa to encourage. So I imagine that this would be of personal interest to King Charles, as well as possibly onto the agenda with regards to our transition away from coal-fired and the opportunities that exist for renewable energies. We can't get away from the context of the gas issues as Europe searches for new, and the UK searches for new forms of energy after what's happened with Russia and Ukraine. We look at Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. We look at the gas deposits off our own coast. I mean, there's lots of controversy around that, but I would assume that that would be something business-wise and sort of strategically that would be important both to South Africa, at least to this government, and also to the UK. In terms of the Commonwealth itself, yes, I mean, I think in some ways, what the death of the Queen sort of heralded was in a lot of ways the denouement of the British Empire and the crumbling of that sort of edifice for the decades. And in many cases, I think South Africa represents that kind of sort of connection to the past. So it wouldn't be about necessarily reviving the Commonwealth, but about making it sort of contemporarily important, not necessarily because there was some, former colonial, should we say, relationship between South Africa and the UK, but because the UK wants to make it make itself relevant again to those countries that it has close ties economic and politically with, and South Africa is one of those. So it would see South Africa as sort of an entry point into then possibly further solidifying other kinds of relationships, both economically and politically, with Commonwealth countries, particularly in this continent. As Africa reclaims a space in the international arena that would be, I think, quite economically important for European countries in particular on the energy front.
I'd like to go back to the climate change issue, because we understand that the new king is also likely to make his first state visit to France because of the rapport he enjoyed with the French President Emmanuel Macron. And on this issue of Liz Truss, speculation that she could be looking at scaling back just on some of the commitments made by Britain. And I'm thinking here about developed nations, particularly Africa, on the issue of compensation for what the more developed countries need to be looking at paying up in order to help further develop the continent, but also for the amount of fossil fuel damage that we incur. How brave is President Cyril Ramaphosa likely to be on raising this issue and also raising it strongly?
I don't think he's really going to take the opportunity to rock the boat too much. He'd probably raise it as something that is pertinent, something that South Africa really needs. I mean, it's a politically, how should we say, correct kind of issue to be pushing. But my sense is that President Ramaphosa is going to mainly use this visit to try to reclaim some of the lost ground with investment, with trade ties, with trying to get some kind of renewed preferential treatment, because the United Kingdom is now, after Brexit, is seeking much more bilateral agreements with different countries. And so what is that going to take shape in the next few years with regards not only to the energy and the just transition issues, but also just with regards to our exports. I mean, since COVID, South Africa's exports to the EU and European Union on a range of fronts, for example, in terms of deciduous fruits, in terms of other kinds of manufactured products have increased quite substantially. So there is a room here to use this more as a business visit, but the flip side to that, which of course we haven't even talked about, is that it looks as though Ramaphosa is going to get a roasting from the British media on the Pala scandal. They're already doing this already. And so it's sort of like he might find this very, very useful in one ways, but it might hurt him domestically and politically because of the exposure now of this on an international scale. And so that's another element to the visit that Yeah,
and unfortunately we have run out of time, because that was a question I was going to ask, that for South Africans, does this visit bear any benefits? Thank you so much, though, for speaking to us, political economist Dr Dale McKinley, who's also an independent writer and researcher.